Welcome to the People Teaching People podcast. I'm so glad that you're here. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you all know that this will be my last episode before heading into summer holidays. Both me and my podcast take the summer off. So the People Teaching People podcast will be returning with new episodes starting in September. So stay tuned. Also, I wanted to share a new tool that I've created called Your Expertise Ready to Download. Turn what you know into an impactful, downloadable resource. And in this printable workbook, I walk you through a simple approach for turning your expertise into a high impact resource to support the humans that you work with, like a workbook, worksheet, checklist, guide, or template. And it includes a downloadable resource blueprint, tips for high impact resources, tools to support your creative process, AI prompts to support your thinking, and more. And you can find it on my website, tianafech.com/learn for only $9.99. And I have to say, I'm pretty darn proud of this tool and know that it will be a big help for folks. If you get it and use it, please reach out and tell me what you've created for your people. Now for today's episode. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to spend the morning with 3 different grade 7 classes at the Calgary French and International School in Calgary, Alberta, as part of their DaVinci Days program. DaVinci Days are experiential learning days where students step away from their regular schedule to explore careers, ideas, and possibilities through hands-on learning experiences. This particular day focused on an expanded view of the trades, and I was invited to share the world of podcasting. Over the course of the morning, I introduced students to podcasting and explored some of the many career pathways connected to the industry. We talked about what podcasts are, how they're created, and the surprisingly large ecosystem of people, skills, and businesses involved in the podcasting industry. My career in education began teaching junior high science and leadership, and although a lot has changed since those early years in my career, there was something familiar about being back with grade 7 students again. Connecting with students at that stage of their learning journey felt a little like coming home. The invitation itself was also a reminder of the unexpected connections that learning creates. I was invited by Lisa Webb, the Career and Pathways Lead at Calgary French and International School. Lisa and I first connected when she was a guest on my podcast, and then here I was spending a morning learning alongside students at her school. These moments of connection always remind me that learning is often less about plans and more about people. A conversation led to a connection led to an opportunity. And that opportunity led me back into a grade 7 classroom talking about podcasting. As part of my podcasting session, I wanted students to experience a piece of the creative process that happens behind the scenes. Every podcast starts with ideas, questions, and conversations. So I invited the students to help me with a real podcast project. Working in what I called podcast creative teams, I had students help me plan this episode of the People Teaching People podcast, focused on what can adults learn about teaching and learning from students. I asked them to share their ideas in response to 4 questions. What actually helps you learn best? If you could change one thing about learning, what would it be? What is something you wish more adults understood about students today? And finally, what is one important thing you want adults to know and remember? The responses that followed were thoughtful, honest, insightful, and sometimes surprising. And as I read through them afterward, I found myself returning to many of their comments. They weren't simply answering questions. They were sharing experiences, observations, frustrations, hopes, and ideas about learning. Some responses made me smile, some made me pause, and some reminded me of things that can be easy for adults to forget. Perhaps that's one of the reasons I love podcasting so much. It creates opportunities to learn from people whose experiences are different from our own. In this case, those teachers happen to be a group of grade 7 students. So today I want to share some of what they taught me. When I asked the students what they would change about learning, I expected to see some common themes emerge, and I certainly did. Students talked about tests, grades, homework, flexibility, movement, projects, and having more opportunities to learn in ways that felt engaging and meaningful to them. What struck me, however, was that their responses weren't really about wanting less learning. Instead, they seemed to be asking for different learning. One student wrote, "Focus on the actual learning experience and not just the final results or grade." As someone who spends a lot of time helping people design courses, workshops, and learning experiences, I found myself smiling when I read that response. It's a conversation many educators, facilitators, and learning designers are having as well. How do we create experiences where learning matters more than simply measuring learning? Apparently, that's a question grade 7 students are thinking about too. Several students talked about wanting fewer tests and more projects. One group suggested that tests shouldn't count as much towards grades and that participation, group activities, and contributions in class should matter more as well. Another student shared less tests and more projects because they help make you think more. What I found really interesting about these comments was that they weren't really about avoiding challenges. They seemed to be about wanting more opportunities to demonstrate learning in different ways. There was also a strong desire for learning to feel more active. Students talked about wanting less sitting and more doing, more hands-on activities, more movement, and more opportunities to engage with ideas rather than simply listen to them. One student wrote, "Not all talking, more action." Another shared more interactive activities that you don't just sit and listen to. Do something while listening. As I read through the responses, I found myself thinking about how often engagement and learning become separated in our minds. Sometimes we treat engagement as an extra, as though making learning interesting is simply a bonus. Yet many of these students seem to be saying something different. For them, engagement wasn't separate from learning, it was part of learning. Another theme that appeared throughout the responses was flexibility. Students talked about wanting more freedom in what they learn, more opportunities to learn at their own pace, and more recognition that different learners need different things. One response in particular stayed with me. A student wrote, "Some teachers teach students the way they learned, but they need to understand that others comprehend in a different way." I had to pause when I read that comment because it is such an insightful observation. At its heart, it's a reminder that our own experiences as learners don't automatically translate into someone else's experience. What worked for us may not work for everyone else. The strategies, approaches, and structures that helped us learn are only one piece of a much larger picture. In many ways, this idea connects directly back to the responses from the first question. Students were reminding us that learners are diverse and that effective learning experiences create room for those differences. I was also struck by how many comments reflected a desire to shift the focus away from grades and toward learning itself. One student wrote that learning and understanding are more important than grades. Another questioned whether tests often measure memory rather than knowledge, understanding, or progress. Whether or not adults agree with every suggestion, I think there's something important to pay attention to here. The students weren't critiquing school, they were reflecting on their experiences and offering ideas about what helps them learn and what gets in the way. The more I read through their responses, the more I realized that the students weren't asking adults to lower expectations. They were asking adults to think more deeply about how learning happens And as I continued reading, another powerful theme began to emerge. The students weren't just talking about learning, they were also talking about what it feels like to be a student today. As I continued reading through the responses, I noticed that many of the students were trying to communicate something that extended beyond learning strategies, classroom activities, or assessment practices. They wanted adults to understand their reality. Again and again, students shared comments that reflected a desire to be understood as individuals rather than assumptions. They wanted adults to recognize that their experiences, pressures, challenges, and perspectives may not always be the same as those of previous generations. One student wrote, "Our work today is harder than what you had. This is a different time." Another shared, "We don't live in the 1900s. Adults can learn from young people. Kids can have wisdom." That response made me smile, but it also made me think. Students today are growing up in a world that looks very different from the one many adults experienced. They have access to information in ways previous generations never did. They are navigating social media, constant connectivity, and a rapidly changing world. Whether those changes are positive, negative, or somewhere in between, they are shaping how students experience learning and life. Several students also spoke about pressure. One wrote, "Just because we are younger doesn't mean we don't struggle or have pressure." And another shared, "There is more pressure than there was back then. Mental health plays a bigger role than grades." As I read through these responses, I found myself thinking about how easy it can be for adults to underestimate what young people are carrying. We sometimes assume that because students are younger, their worries must be smaller or simpler. Yet, many of these students were telling us that they are balancing academic expectations, social pressures, extracurricular commitments, relationships, uncertainty about the future, and all of the challenges that come with growing up. One response in particular stayed with me. "We have emotions that deserve to be acknowledged rather than discounted as hormones or being a moody teen." I think that comment captures something much bigger than adolescence. At its core, it's about wanting to be seen and understood. It's about wanting experiences and feelings to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. It's about wanting someone to listen before jumping to conclusions. Another comment that I found myself returning to was incredibly simple. Teachers need to get to know their students before teaching them. The more I sat with that statement, the more significant it became. Students don't arrive in classrooms as blank slates. They arrive with interests, strengths, worries, responsibilities, experiences, and challenges. They bring things that are visible and things that are invisible. In many ways, this comment reflects something that extends beyond education. Whether we are teaching, parenting, coaching, leading, or simply supporting another person, relationships matter. Understanding matters, and feeling known matters. As I reflected on all of these responses together, I realized that the students weren't asking adults to have all the answers, and they weren't asking adults to remove every challenge. What they seemed to be asking for was something much simpler and much more human. They wanted adults to take the time to understand the people behind the learning. They wanted to be seen as individuals, not assumptions. They wanted to be heard before being judged. And honestly, that feels like a lesson that extends far beyond classrooms. As I worked my way through the responses, I noticed something interesting. Although the students had answered different questions throughout the activity, many of their ideas seemed to circle back to a handful of common themes. They talked about learning, certainly, but they also talked about understanding, relationships, pressure, flexibility, creativity, and what it feels like to be a student today. The more I read, the more I realized that many of their responses weren't isolated thoughts. They were connected to one another. One student wrote, "The only person you should try to be better than is you yesterday." Another shared, "Learning and understanding is more important than grades." A third reminded us that intelligence comes in all shapes and sizes. I found myself pausing after each of these comments because they contain a level of wisdom that many adults continue to wrestle with throughout their lives. They are simple statements, but they speak to growth, self comparison, learning, and the recognition that people bring different strengths and abilities to the world. Other students focused on perspective. One wrote, "Think like a teenager or the people you are teaching." Another shared, "They can learn from kids. They might think that they have less experience, but they might have different experiences." I really appreciated that distinction. Different experiences. Not better experiences, not worse experiences, just different. It feels like an important reminder that learning doesn't only happen when information moves from adults to young people. Sometimes learning happens when we take the time to understand experiences that are different from our own. Several students returned to themes of balance, pressure, and well-being. They talked about stress, busy schedules, the need for breaks, and the importance of having time to recharge. One student wrote, "Just because we are young doesn't mean we aren't struggling or have pressure and stress." Another shared that learning and breaks should feel more balanced because students can't do everything at once. As I read those responses, I found myself thinking about how often adults focus on helping students achieve while sometimes forgetting to ask how they are doing. Achievement matters, but so do people. Learning matters, but so does well being. The students seem to be reminding us that those things really are connected. There was also a strong desire for learning to feel meaningful and engaging. Students talked about wanting more creativity, more interaction, and more opportunities to actively participate in learning. One student wrote, "We can learn more if it's more creative and interactive instead of repetitive paperwork." Another shared that interactive activities are often more memorable and easier to remember later. Reading those comments brought me back to something that appeared throughout many of the responses. The students weren't asking adults to make learning easier, they were asking adults to make learning matter. Perhaps the response that stayed with me the most was this one: "Kids these days are not as simple as before. We have access to social media, there's constant social pressure, and mental health concerns. Acknowledge teens for who they are and how they feel to the same degree that you would an adult." I kept coming back to that comment because in many ways it seemed to capture the heart of what the students were trying to tell us throughout all 4 questions. They wanted to be understood. They wanted to be heard. They wanted adults to recognize that they are navigating a complex world and that their experiences, perspectives, and feelings deserve to be taken seriously. When I look across all of the responses together, I don't think the students were asking adults to have all the answers. I don't think they were asking adults to make learning easy or remove every challenge. What they seemed to be asking for was something much more human. They were asking adults to listen, to be curious, to take the time to understand the people behind the learning. And maybe that's the biggest lesson they shared with me that day. As I think back to that morning at the Calgary French International School, I can't help but smile at the full circle nature of it all. I arrived to talk about podcasting. I shared stories and the possibilities connected to the world of podcasting. As part of the session, I invited students to think like podcasters and help me plan a future episode of the People Teaching People podcast. I knew the students would help shape this episode. After all, that was the activity. But what I didn't know was what they would say. I didn't know which ideas would emerge, which comments would make me smile, or which responses would stay with me long after that session ended. As I read through their thoughts afterwards, I was struck by the honesty, insight, and self-awareness reflected in so many of their responses. The students reminded me that young people often understand far more about their own learning experiences than adults realize. They also reminded me that when we create opportunities for people to share their perspectives, we often really learn something in return. In many ways, the students demonstrated the very idea that sits at the heart of this podcast. Learning is never a one-way street. We all have something to teach, and we all have something to learn. When we create space for different perspectives, ask thoughtful questions, and genuinely listen to one another, new understanding becomes possible. Their ideas, experiences, and reflections became the foundation for this episode, and I am so grateful that they were willing to share them. Some responses, as I said, made me smile, some made me pause, and some reminded me of things that can be easy for adults to forget. Most importantly, they reminded me that wisdom doesn't belong to any particular age group. Sometimes it comes from experience or it comes from expertise. And sometimes it comes from a group of grade 7 students who are willing to share their honest thoughts about learning. So perhaps the invitation for all of us is to spend a little more time listening, to ask questions, to be curious, to create opportunities for people to share their experiences. And maybe, just maybe, to remember that learning can happen in both directions when we're willing to hear perspectives that are different from our own. Before I wrap up, I want to take a moment to say thank you. Thank you to the grade 7 students who attended and participated in my podcasting sessions at the Calgary French and International School. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, experiences, and perspectives so openly and thoughtfully. You approach the questions with honesty, curiosity, and a level of insight that genuinely impressed me. This episode exists because of your willingness to contribute. And I hope that if you're listening, you hear your ideas reflected through our conversation today. Thank you to the Calgary French and International School for welcoming me into your learning community. It was a privilege to spend the morning with your students and to be part of such a meaningful learning experience through your DaVinci Days. And thank you to Lisa Webb for the invitation. Lisa, I appreciate the work that you do to create opportunities for students to explore different pathways, possibilities, and ways of learning. I also love that this opportunity began with a podcast conversation and eventually led to a morning of learning together with your students. It feels like a wonderful example of the unexpected connections that learning can create. And thank you for joining me today on the People Teaching People podcast. If this episode resonated for you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to continuing to learn from people of all ages and stages together.